And I mean, that's just genius. You know, that is on any level, modern storytelling or ancient storytelling, it is stupendous narrative art to tell the story in that way. It's matchless.
How can mythology shed light on AI? Is Odysseus really a hero? And how did ancient Greek inspire one young man who, according to him, wasn't good at anything? Hello, my name is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. For many of my listeners, today's guest needs no introduction. You may know him from his TV shows and movies, and depending on your age, it will either be Blackadder, Jesus Wooster, or Harry Potter. Or you may also know him for his excellent series on Greek mythology, including Mythos, Heroes, Troy, and his upcoming book, The Retelling of the Odyssey. Either way, it was a real pleasure speaking with the English actor, broadcaster, comedian, director, narrator, and writer, Stephen Fry. We discuss mythology, technology, and how ancient Greek opens up the amazing world of the classics. But before we begin, a big thank you to our Classical Wisdom members who keep Classical Wisdom alive with their support. To subscribe to our free newsletter or join our growing community, please check out classicalwisdom.com. Now, on to Stephen Fry. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today and to talk about Greek mythology and the classics. It's so exciting that you've been writing in this space for a while. And I remember when I first read Mythos, I was like, this is so fun and it's enjoyable and it's great for people who don't know about the classics, but also for people who do spend a lot of time. It's just fun to just enjoy them. But I wanted to ask, considering sort of the depth and breadth of your career from TV and film to technology startups and charity, it's quite a lot of different types of projects. What brought you to the classics?
Well, at school, I was the victim, I suppose is the correct word, of the English classical education, as they call it. That's to say, I was sent away from home at the age of 7 to go and board at a school. And to be truthful, and there's not false modesty, I was so bad at everything that boys are supposed to be good at. I athletics, I couldn't run, I couldn't catch a ball. I was hopeless, the names they would shout at me when I tried to join in on the football field or on the cricket pitch. I couldn't swim. It took me ages to learn to swim. I think it was 12 before I could swim. So my body was a letdown. I couldn't play a musical instrument. I couldn't sing. I couldn't draw or color in. I couldn't paint. And for the first kind of term or so, as the age of about 7, I thought I was just, oh God, I was inadequate. But I discovered I had this passion for language or instinct for language that no other boys had. I mean, it started in the silliest way in a music lesson when the teacher wrote up on the board orchestra, and I shouted out cart horse, and he said, "What?" I said, "Cart horse," because I just saw the letters rearranged from orchestra into cart horse. Gave me a funny look and then chatted. And I started to win a few prizes on writing stories and compositions and things. And I then really enjoyed Latin when we learnt it very early. I think I was probably 8 when we started our Amo, Amasa, Mata, Mamas, Amatus, Amant lessons. And I thrilled to it. It was like a game. I loved it. I loved how concentrated the language was. I loved the fact that you could put in all the particles, as a Greek scholar would call the small words, into the body of the word itself. In other words, inflection intrigued me, and how so often you'd have a line of 12 words, and when you translated it into Latin, it would be 5 words. And that struck me as so fascinating about Latin. And anyway, the Latin teachers saw that I was getting a lot of pleasure out of it and asked if I wanted to learn Greek. And I said yes. And then I was very excited because it was like a code to have this new alphabet. And I taught my friends how to read the Greek alphabet, so we would send each other messages using English, of course, but with Greek characters. And that was like, so it was a sort of secret thing. Plus my love of philology, as I would now grandly call it, or etymology, but the origins of words. I remember being very amused because in the book, as you work through it, whenever you learnt a new verb or noun, it would try and give you an English one that had come from it. So, phonos and grammain, to write, and so on. Pretty obvious where there are words like grammar and telegram and so forth. And you would go through it and it would be very pleasing. And then, then I saw there was some sentence, I don't know, it was probably from, by this time you're getting bits of Xenophon, to translate the anabasis and so on. And it had thaumazo, the verb, to wonder at, to marvel. And it said in the little footnote or the little asterisk, whatever, thaumazo, to wonder at or marvel, to make a. This is easily remembered by thinking of the English word thaumaturge. I was like 9 years old or whatever, thinking thaumaturge, and I obviously had to go to a dictionary, and you can work out what it means. A worker of wonders, but a miracle worker. And of course, I haven't forgotten it. So in that sense, it was good. But that was, and then of course, all around it, the stories, the unbelievable stories. There were some historical ones, Battle of Marathon and things like that were very exciting. Thermopylae and the Spartans and the Sacred Band and all the history things, but above all, the myths. And when it got more sort of senior and I was a teenager, obviously you were then learning or looking at Euripides and Aeschylus and Sophocles and almost all their stories come, of course, from the myths, that they all do, and from different aspects of them. The fact that they could each write about, Electra or some other character, and from a different point of view. And as a child, I continued to read the Robert Graves children's edition of his, and actually a lot of American mythologists, really fine mythographers, I should say. Edith Hamilton, who was really good, I thought. Thomas Bullfinch for the sort of rather more Victorian kind of way of doing it. And similarly Nathaniel Hawthorne with beautiful writing, very poetic. I can remember, I think it was called The Magic Pitcher, not picture, but pitcher, as in baseball pitcher or jug pitcher, which is the story of Philemon and Baucis, and the visit from Zeus and Hermes, and how he makes them. And it just was such a marvelous piece of storytelling. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I about 6 years ago, I was at a dinner party, and for some reason I can't remember why the conversation turned to something, and I started talking about I may have even have been castration or some strange subject, and I said I said it always reminds me of the amazing story, of Uranus, the god, and his castration by Kronos, and they looked at me and said, "What?" And I said, "Well, the before we got the Olympians, there was a lot of parricide, a lot of overturning of the father, which is such a trope in Greek myth, the son trying to outdo the father." And so I told the story of that, and then the story of Zeus and and how Zeus and Rhea tricked Kronos, and they stared at me as if I was like some from another planet, and said, "How do you know all this?" I said, "Well, I just sort of remember it from childhood, and they said, "Well, that's amazing. That's a really incredible story. I'm amazed I never heard it." And I thought about it, and I thought what fun I had telling it. And at first I thought of it as a stage show. I thought we could do a stage show in which you just kind of brought the Greek myths to life with telling and a bit of, artful son et lumière, if you like. But then I just started writing the next morning after, this is very 21st century, sort of checking on the internet that someone else wasn't doing this, because it struck me as so obvious a thing to do, to retell the Greek myths in my language, in English, in the way that Robert Graves had, and and Edith Hamilton, whom we mentioned, and a few others, you know. And I saw that there wasn't really. I mean, there were graphic novels and comics in which Theseus was called, you know, a clever dude and all that sort of thing, and they're aimed for a very particular kind of teenage market. And there were something very good. There was Percy Jackson, of course, that I think already existed. But that was about it. And there was Neil Gaiman, who had done it for Norse mythology. It just come out while I was writing the first one, Mythos. And so I wrote to Neil, who's a friend, and said, look, no hidden agenda here. I'm going to come right out and tell you. It's an unhidden agenda. I'm writing this thing on the Greek myths. You're not going to turn from Norse to Greek now, are you? Because in which case I'm dead. He said, no, I have no plans. Don't worry. So I carried on with it, and it was. I think everyone at Penguin was surprised how well it went down, which in publishers' terms, of course, means how many it sold, which was, you know, a bunch to say the least. And um, uh, so I had left out, because the book would have been too massive, I'd left out the heroes. So then I moved on to Theseus, Heracles, Perseus, Jason, Atalanta, and so on. And the heroic age, if you like, and the beating of all the monsters. And then it was natural to do Troy. I thought I might try and do Troy and the homecoming, the Nostos element. I thought I might try and do that in one book, but I realized once I
Too
was
much.
into it that Troy was one book, and because after all, you know, the Iliad, yes, is, but that's only a few months because
Yeah.
I haven't worked out how many days the Iliad is in its Aristotelian unities of time and place. It's quite, but obviously the whole war is a lot more. So I've just finished Odyssey about a month or so ago, and that's coming out in October. So that's the kind of background to it, anyway.
Well, it's so exciting. And I mean, it is, as you say, it's sometimes shocking when talking to people how little Greek mythology is taught, understood, discussed
Mm.
in modern life. And yet, you know, you go to the museums, and if you want to appreciate the art when you're walking around the British Museum or the Prado or the Louvre, I mean, you have to know what the stories are
Exactly
about.
right. And actually at Cambridge that we have this. I actually I didn't read classics at Cambridge. I sort of felt guilty, but Cambridge classics is the most severe in terms of language. That's to say, almost any other university now you don't have to do. Um, it's confusing. They call them unseens. Unseen translation is when you're given a piece of Greek or Latin and you translate that into English. That's okay. But in Cambridge, they still expect you to write in Latin and Greek. And I had friends doing classics, and if they were doing Greek, the tutor, the supervisor would give them it could be anything. It could be a piece of Jane Austen. It could be the op-ed piece in the Times, and say, I want this in Thucydidean Greek. And literally they would come to with the translation and read it out, read out the Greek they'd written, and hand him the page. And uh, the the professor would say, Eithegenoimen. It's a good phrase. I know certainly we find it in Herodotus, but I don't think it's Thucydidean, is it? Can you point me to the source? And unless you can say, oh, yes, this book here, this, you know, then, and similarly in Latin, it would be Ciceronian or Tacitan that you had to write in the Latin. And that I thought, well, that's a bit much for me. In other universities, they have courses called classical civilization, or you know, ones that combine ancient history with philosophy, poetry, literature, generally drama, and a bit of mythology, but don't strictly insist that you have to write Greek perfectly. Anyway, so I read English, but anyway, what the point I was coming to was that we would do these supervisions sometimes in groups of 3 or 4, though your actual teaching is one-on-one in Cambridge. That's a great sort of privilege of it. But you would do these what they call practical criticism classes, where he would give you a poem and that you didn't know who it was by, or a piece of writing, and you had to just talk about it in terms of its style and whatever else you would try. You'd do a close reading, as they call it. And I can remember, again, being shocked by the people around me who were brilliant, some of the undergraduates my age. You know, they were very, very smart. But you get a piece of Keats like Endymion or something, and they just have no idea who, the Selenia was, or, and who Endymion might be, and the sort of world it came from. And not teaching Greek myths is turning people off from shutting the door, if you like, on a huge part of our cultural shared history. And it isn't like a separate creature that's different from Greek philosophy, from Aristotle, from Plato, from the Greek history of Solon and Pericles and whoever else you choose. It is part of the Greek mind as well. I mean, it's no accident. And so much of Plato, he uses Greek myth to explain things and makes references to Homer specifically. So we know that all that extraordinary 5th century Athenian explosion of thinking and talking and rhetoric and everything else. We know that it was very, very Homer literate, and they used Homer. That he was their Shakespeare, and we have inherited so much of their thinking and way of life that we should also understand the way they used the poetry of narrative, which is what you get in so much Greek myth that explains us.
Yeah, no, I mean it's amazing. The more you study the classics, the more you find it again and again and again. And the mythology, as you say, it's fundamental to philosophy. It was fundamental to the ancients, to the very foundations. But I'm sure you spend a lot of time talking to people and explaining the need for mythology in general and why
Yes.
we should learn it, and how it's applicable to our modern lives. What do you tell them beyond just, okay, you get the references?
Well, I mean, there are certain connections with now and Greek mythology that I just kind of hope will wake people up to how mythological stories of the kind of sophistication, sounds such an off-putting word, but of the complexity and wonder that you find in Greek myths, how they speak to us now in often surprisingly direct ways. And I think I mean, there are a couple that are. One is like a personal one that I felt. I've always been, as you mentioned in your introduction, very keen on, excited by technology, shall we say. I've been slapped in the face by it, as we all have, and that's my point. In the early 90s, when I was becoming aware, I had joined things like CompuServe, and it was before there was a World Wide Web, but the idea of the internet was beginning to grow and expand, and the possibility of linking with people all around the world. And I had this idea. That the internet, as it developed, was the all gifted. It was theater, cinema, assemblies, public squares. It was art galleries. It was therapists' offices. Yes, like a great city, it had its red light district where you wouldn't want children to go after dark, and but it was human and it was organic, and surely this would be the end of people misunderstanding each other. So, this would melt away borders and boundaries and disagreements and all the hideous tribal hatreds that had characterized the world until this point. I know how naive this sounds now, obviously. And in some ways, yes, it was the all gifted. And what is the Greek for all gifted? Pandora. And Pandora came down, and she was all gifted. The Hera had given her poise and charm and, courtly manners, and Aphrodite had given her beauty and her seductive loveliness, and, Hermes had given her, etc., etc., etc. She was all gifted. And the internet was all gifted, and it was going to be the most wonderful, beautiful addition, in the same way that Pandora was the most wonderful, beautiful addition to the golden age of man. And what happened? She opened the lid. And what happened to the internet? The lid opened, and out came the bad actors, as they like to call them, the malware, the grooming, the abuse, the terrible, terrible everything, the trolling and the meanness and the hacking and the everything. And we slammed the lid back on, do we? Or is Elpis left banging against the inside of the jar. So that's an example of how the Greeks that in a myth like that, you get a sense of how humanity has this sense that everything was once great, and it's always getting worse. Things are always flying out, new problems, new issues. But the most extraordinary one, because it's another subject that absolutely fascinates me, which is AI and the possibility of sentient AI, is that we are in a position that the gods were in and Prometheus was in. When Prometheus made us and loved us and wanted us to thrive, and Zeus had forbidden, as we know, the gift of fire, which we all understand to be both literal fire, the fire that gave us the technology to hit the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age, and the fire to melt and smelt and roast and toast and really protect us from animals. Plato has a wonderful explanation, doesn't he, of another Prometheus thing, that all the animals were given their weapons, you know, their horns, their claws, their echolocation, their ability to fly, to swim, to bite. And when they got left to poor naked man, there was nothing left. So he got fire, and the fire is, as I say, is the real flames that keep us safe from animals and allow us, you know, to make pottery and all kinds of other things to make our lives better. But it's also the divine spark, the spark that came down from heaven in the fennel stalk, the spark of creativity, but also of self-consciousness and of understanding, of desire to name things and control things and be a kind of God. And that's what Zeus knew. We cannot give these little anthropoi, we cannot give them the fire that we have, because if we do, they won't need us anymore. Ultimately, they will live their own lives. And the arc of the myths that I've described in my books is exactly that. By the time we get to the Odyssey, it is that nostos, that move home, is moved to the hearth. It ends at the hearth. If you remember the final scene, I mean, the final real scene, obviously there's the little coda of going, you know, inland and fight with his oar and so on. But the sort of end really is Penelope and Odysseus embracing in their hearth, at their hearth, with Telemachus kind of looking on, slightly shuffling his feet embarrassedly, as a young man would when their parents kiss. And the gods are nowhere. They've gone. It's now a domestic human world. And obviously it's a simplicity and things not quite like that, but that is a sort of feeling of it. And, you know, Zeus, you know, the punishment he gave Prometheus was enormous, but you can almost argue Prometheus deserved it, because in that one single act, he killed the gods. And Zeus knew it was coming, and all the gods knew it was coming. It was their Ragnarok. It was far less of a war. It wasn't like the Gigantomachy. It wasn't a war in that sense, but it was. You go out to Olympus now, and they've crumbled into dust. You can barely make out their shapes, except they live inside us, of course. They live in the stories as we retell them, but they're gone. And maybe this had happened before. You know, maybe even before the Titans and the first gods. You know, before even Gaia and ether and the very first elements were formed, because it's happening again. As we know, Prometheus became the Christ of the new secular age for a lot of artists in the Romantic. Once the age of reason, the age of you know, the Enlightenment had, as it were, kicked over the Aristotelian ecclesiasticism of the medieval world, and the Neoplatonism had lit the new way of thinking, and humanism became a result of it, and then Romanticism. It's no accident that within a kind of year of each other, that Beethoven wrote The Creatures of Prometheus, and Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound, a dialogue between, he calls him Jove, Jupiter, and Prometheus, but you know, and more importantly, his wife Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, whose subtitle is The Modern Prometheus, a modern Prometheus, because it's about this idea of creating a new intelligent species and whether we could do it, and kick-started by a sort of connection, which was Byron's daughter, Ada Lovelace, the first mathematician to consider the idea that you could program a machine. She and Charles Babbage worked on that. And then, of course, much later, Alan Turing set out the possibility. And now, thanks to Moore's law and the growth and astonishing exponential improvement of computing power and the enormous addition to the world of data, of digital data, that has been growing and growing every year since, you know, the 80s. Now there is a possibility that we have created these little anthropi. We are Prometheus. And some of us are Zeus. They're saying, no, you mustn't let these sentient beings, you mustn't give them consciousness, this AGI, as it's known, artificial general intelligence, when it actually is able to think for itself, have a sense, maybe even an ethical sense, maybe something sucked up and combined, because we don't know how our own brain works. So how can we know how, you know, this is one of the most frightening things that OpenAI, who run ChatGPT, and Sam Altman just said yesterday, we don't understand how our machines work, how our neural networks really work. We actually don't understand. And we don't understand how the brain works. So we are in this position. We could be made redundant like Zeus. You know, if these AI, they may look at, I mean, someone may ask them a stupid question for a start. Like, I set you, please, the task of stopping climate change. They wouldn't have to think a trillionth of a second before they press the button that got rid of us all, because the only thing that is causing climate change is humanity. So if you didn't give them the question carefully, we would all disappear. And it would go, I've solved it. Where is everybody? but you know, the point is that the way the Greeks understood the most important questions about ourselves, why are we different? What makes us different from animals and so close to gods? But, you know, and if there are gods, they must be like us because they've made us. Unlike the Hebraic way of imagining a perfect God that we must grovel to and apologize to, we understood that humanity is beautiful and majestic and imaginative and creative, but it's also dark, fierce, impulsive, instinctive, cruel, irrational. And therefore the gods must be that. And so you have a mythological world which is full of juice, full of human qualities, but with the power of the creative force behind all the other creative forces like nature and so on, weather and the sea and things. And obviously, we still use I mean, in our heads, ideas like most writers, if you talk to them about inspiration, um, uh, will say that, yeah, the idea of a muse whispering in your ear is a very good one, because in quite sexist ways, the fact that the muse is a female it suits a lot of male writers to say, yes, they seduce you in your ear with this wonderful thing. And you think, yes, thank you, Cleo, or whichever muse it is that's inspiring you at that particular time. Then the next morning you go, you fickle thing, you were lying to me, you know, because that's how the muses are. But they are, you know, and demonology, you know, in the Greek sense, eudemonism and so on, are they're just such wonderful ways of looking at the world, and particularly looking at ourselves and our behavior. There's no language we really have to describe all the things that sociology and anthropology try to describe. There's either a theological language, a language of, you know, sin and destiny and, you know, trespass and all those things, or there is the more like an animist, which is an element of animism in Greek mythology, of course, with the nymphs and the dryads and hamadryads and all the other wonders. It's just a better way of thinking and feeling. I think my dear friend Christopher Hitchens, who was a wonderful journalist and writer, he always said that we all agree that it's very tiresome whenever anyone begins a sentence with "the world is divided into ... It's 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 like the one that looks better on paper, which looks like the world is divided into 10 people, those who understand binary and those who don't, which is very clever. It's
I
1
love
0.
that.
But anyway, he said the world is divided into two people, literalists and ironists. And we would argue about this because, I said, well, it's literalists, and yes, in your world of journalism, ironists. That's to say, people who don't understand. It doesn't mean sarcasm. It's a much wider sense of irony. I said it's really literalists and figurativists, or metaphorists, those who best understand the world through a narrative, transferred from somewhere else, which is what a metaphor is, as you know, in Greek. I love the fact that if you go to Athens, you see a lorry passing where it says metaphores, and
Yeah.
it means removal. It moves things around. Furniture van. It's a furniture van. Metaphores, because it's moving your stuff. So yeah, can I have a moving van, please? And that's it, metaphores. There you are. And of course, the Greeks have got to live with only their language. See, we in Britain forget that we have three languages to choose from whenever we're talking. So we can choose the Anglo-Saxon. I love you very much. We can use the Latin, you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection, as Oscar Wilde puts it in Importance of Being Earnest. Or you can use the Greek, which is the technical. There's an erotic. There's something, because all our physical body is Greek, to a doctor, all the words for the organs and, all these things is nearly all Greek, not entirely. There's Latin, obviously, for various areas of things, but a lot of it is Greek, and diseases are Greek. And of course, technology is Greek. The very word technology, techne, is a very important Greek word for us, as is tele, one of the most important particles is tele, because of course, action at a distance is what has created our modern world. The fact that, and the Greeks understood this. This is the other thing, is their science. I love the fact that they noticed that the fossilized resin from a tree, amber as we call it, which is from an Arabic source, actually, the name amber, but we call it amber. If you rub it on a python or whatever, it can attract dust and feathers and bits and, and also that there were rocks in Thessaly, in the area known as Magnesia, where bits of iron would cling to the rock. So they named the rocks after Magnesia. They call them magnetite, and we get our word magnet from that. Things are magnetic. And that's action from a distance, which is an extraordinary thing, because in all our life, all the things we make move because of our calories, because we use our hands or our feet or even blowing them, but it's not at a distance. We can see the physical reason that things can move. Suddenly you have a thing, a stone and a piece of iron, and go, and there's nothing doing it. There's not a god. They sort of knew it wasn't a god. All the other actions at a distance, like rain and roses being pushed through a bud, causing spring, that was Demeter, and rain was Zeus, and volcanoes were Hephaestus, and so on. But these magnets, wow! And then these amber, and what's the Greek for amber? Electron. And so they called this amberiness electricity. And then hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years later, in fact, well, 1500 years later or so, there's Alessandro Volta is playing with this amberiness and storing it and creating the first battery and the volt and so on. And then, obviously, most importantly, Maxwell and Faraday prove that magnetism and electricity are the same thing. They're one force, and they seem so different. In other words, you can make electricity by putting a wire through a revolving magnet, and once that's discovered, everything explodes, and suddenly you can have actions at a distance in different ways. You can have a sound at a distance, telephone. You can have writing at a distance, a telegram, and can be done by a machine that is a telegraph. And it is telecommunications, and then you can bastardize Latin and Greek together in a hybrid and have television. And it is, all these things allow you to control things that you're not present at, or receive things. And this is totally new. And it is sparked from this Greek fascination. We use the Greek language to do it. But my point was, of course, that the Greeks only have that language. So if you look at the Greek cinema, whether it says, we say exit, we use the Latin exit. But they say Exodus. I look at it, I think, oh, Exodus. It's so formal. But yeah, sorry, I've been rattling
No,
away.
no,
But
I was going to say I'm a very big Borges fan, and he often talks about one of the things that he loves about English is that it has you can choose from so many
yes,
different backgrounds, and he's like it's so
yeah,
different. The Holy Ghost, which is an Anglo-Saxon word, to the Holy Spirit, which is a Latin word, and the feeling
yes,
that they evoke is so completely different that we
it
have
certainly
a
is.
lot of
And
choices.
yeah, we certainly do. And actually, if you think, I mean, to heal, you heal someone, you make them whole, you heal them, and you give them health. Those are all connected words, heal and health. And we heal. He's a healer. Um, if in Latin, he's a curer, or in fact, a cure of souls is a curate in the church, I suppose. So you have a curate, and if you want to say it in Greek, you'd say a therapist. They all mean the same, but now they can take us a different meaning. And if you say I'm a healer, you think it's a bit new age, which suits the sort of Anglo-Saxon image of someone at a festival near a stone circle, someone being a bit kind of hippie-ish, and they're a healer. And and someone who's using a curative thing is more medical probably. He's cure your disease, and a therapist is again slightly scientific, but a bit not quite as trained or something. You've got three different words just for that. It's so brilliant.
No, I love it. I mean, we've actually started at Classical Wisdom doing ancient Greek word of the week for actually for children. And
Yeah,
it's just one word and it sort of opens up and exposes not just like the history of the word, but the a way of thinking about a lot of things to, like you said, techne, like to think of that as a craft and all these things is just
yes,
it's a great entry, I think, into the ancient world. And it
yeah,
clearly your own story is indicative of that, that it was such a great way to
yes.
open up that world to you.
And I
Um,
think it's like the cliche of being in love. You want to stand on the rooftops and shout it out that you're in love. In a musical, you do it. You just burst out your arms and say, I'm in love." And when you love something as much as the ancient civilization and the stories they tell and the style and the whole kind of character of it, you want to share it. And you want others to get that pleasure. And for me, the single most thrilling thing about these books I've written is getting these letters from children aged 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, teenage, saying that they've just become obsessed and they now read everything they can. Because by a strange, I don't know what it is, there is a marvelously uh, Greco-Latin phrase that is used sometimes by zoologists when a flock of birds learns a behavior somewhere, and another flock of birds that's being monitored, maybe across the world or hundreds of miles away, learns the same behavior, but without any connection between them. And they call that morphic resonance. And by a strange act of morphic resonance, when I was writing mythos, suddenly out came Song of Achilles, the wonderful Madeline Miller novel about Achilles and Patroclus,
oh,
which I'm
she's lovely. Yes,
sure you've read, yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then since then, Circe and so on. But then also Pat Barker, The Silence of the Women, the wonderful novel about the women around the Trojan War. And Natalie Haynes and Bethany Hughes, and obviously then Emily
Wilson.
Wilson with her two translations. Suddenly, this whole new kind of popular and many particularly focused on the women that have been overlooked in mythology, but by the classical world, which has been so male dominated for 200, 300 years from Germany and Britain and America, but is now, of course, primarily women. I'm glad to say that have been writing these books and telling these stories. So there've been stories about, I mean, at least 3 novels about Medusa that have come out,
Yep.
reclaiming Medusa, which is absolutely right because so many people think of her as this monster, but they don't know why she was so unfairly punished for being raped. I mean, that is that the Greeks understood that a woman gets punished for being raped. I mean, that's the story of so much sexual politics in our past age, and that's they're baked into the story of Medusa, which is why you can see how so many people interested. I think, and on, people and people have written kind of really sort of detailed novels of daily life in the, the palace in Mycenae before Agamemnon comes back, and Colm Turbine has written brilliantly about that, and it's absolutely wonderful, and I, what someone asked me at Hay was did I feel threatened that there were so many other people writing in this space now? And I said, no, it's really important that it's like any biodiversity is the key to a healthy, classical appreciation world. That there are lots and lots of voices, and especially wonderful when then these are the detailed ones. And if my books have any role, it may be that they introduce people into these stories, and they're then really keen, and they'll dive in, and then they'll go back and they'll discover Mary Renault, and that was one of the profound joys of my life, reading Persian Boy and The Bull from the Sea. I mean, wow, what amazing novels they were! Absolutely extraordinary, especially if you're gay growing up, because as a female writer, she seemed to have this instinctive understanding of male gay sexuality, which was sort of, you could read the codes of it in her books, even though they were written at a time when you couldn't be that bold about it. So it's quite something. And of course, yes, that's another thing growing up that I found rewarding and refreshing about Greek studies, was the fact that I could be accepted. I could see that they were not bothered about the idea of same-sex love in all its varieties, with Sappho, and within the stories, obviously, Iolaus and Heracles, and Patroclus and Achilles, and Pylades and Orestes, and so on. These are marvelous stories of love and friendship, and then history, Alexander and Hephaestion, and so on, and all the things in the Symposium that they talk about with Alcibiades and Socrates, and so and not to mention Book 13 of the Greek Anthology, the Musa Pederaisko, I think it's good, which is quite sort of eye-popping in its full of the Erastes and so on.
Well, we've done a whole event once on the Sacred Band of Thebes.
Yes, I noticed
With
Washington
James
Post.
Yeah,
The Washington Post did an article about it. I guess in time for Pride Month. Yeah,
yeah. Well,
amazing.
I did an event a few years back with James Rom and Paul Cartledge and Helene Foley, and it was so fascinating to see that role in ancient history. And it's very important to kind of, the more we discover and the more we can talk about the ancient world, the more truth we can find, and that's the
Yes,
end goal, whatever
and
angle.
and the more we can blow away the chalk dust of its academic reputation, and this idea that it's somehow connected with the schoolroom and with Ivy League and Oxbridge, and that's, I mean, I know Paul Cartledge is from my college, so I'm very, very happy about him being involved with you. But yes, I mean, it is so important that people, and also people will say, yeah, are you going on about how great the Greeks are? But look how they had the slaves, and I said, yes, that's a really important thing to come to terms with. That Greek exceptionalism and painting them as a perfect civilization is nonsensical. But they got there first. I mean, their literature and their art and their myths are about the flaws in humanity. They're not. Even the heroes, even the most heroic heroes, have terrible flaws, and make awful mistakes. Look at Theseus forgetting to erect or abandoning Ariadne, and then forgetting to erect the right sails for his father. I mean, they're just terrible. And Heracles and his losses of temper, and his destruction of his own wife and children, and his other awful mistakes. I had this idea that it's incredibly similar. That the descriptions of Hercules, especially when or Heracles, whichever you like, when he does kill his wife and children, and then has to go off and do the labors as penance, is told by the oracle, the Pythia, that he has to. It exactly maps onto a phenomenon known as roid rage. Don't know if you've heard of it, but some WWE wrestlers and bodybuilders, one of them actually killed his wife and children, and they think that it's these steroids that they take for their muscles to make them stronger can cause huge paranoia and hallucinations and terrible problems, and that was the worst example. It was one called Benoit, his name was, and I'm thinking, well, who's the strongest man in myth? Heracles, and he has exactly that problem. Is that just, you know? And similarly, you think there are reasons that can go either back to the ancient creation of a god or to a later embroidery of that god, like Hephaestus. I think he's lame. Well, yes, you know, we love the story of Hera thinking he was so dark and swarthy and ugly that she threw him down Olympus, and he bounced off, you know, and had to be rescued by Thetis and the other, and then taken off to Lemnos or wherever it was, and, you know, brought up. But actually, if you think about the Greek culture in Bronze Age, when they were fighting, um, the strongest, ablest men went into the army, but the ones who were a bit lame, had a club foot, or, you know, had a, you know, were short, didn't fit the type of alpha male you expected in the army, they had to do other jobs that were important, like being a smith, hammering swords, making shields, being like Hephaestus. That the fact that Hephaestus was short and a bit ugly and wasn't a heroic, noble warrior figure actually makes enormous sense. And you know, those kind of details are all through the Greek myths, but most particularly, the most important thing, and I know there was a question you wanted to ask me. I'm sorry I've been babbling on so long, but
No, it's so interesting.
about the character of Oedipus, sorry, of Odysseus, and how can one regard as a hero someone who breaks so many ethical laws and moral laws that we have, but also that the Greeks had. I mean, yes, it's easy to say of any Greek hero, oh yeah, well, you can't judge them by our standards, they have to be judged by Greek standards, but he does break laws of guest friendship, which, as we know, to Homer in particular, seem to be very, very important. Xenia is sort of crucial in so many of the stories he tells. And we know that, you know, it was massively important. It was the Zeus, you know, Zeus's personal, you know, obsession, if you like. And that's why Agamemnon and his family were cursed all the way back to Tantalus, who abused his guest friendship, and was, you know, the line of Tantalus and then Atreus and then Menelaus and Agamemnon down to all the way down to Orestes was suffered from that appalling curse. But so we know how important that is, and we know that, yes, he made decisions. I mean, I think one of the most brilliant moments is when he has to make a decision after being told how Scylla and Charybdis work and how Scylla will, you know, sorry, Charybdis will be inescapable once you get within the influence of the outer swirl of that churning, that the whole ship will be lost. Whereas if you go as fast as you can rowing the Scylla side, she will lean down and she'll take some of your men with each of her arms, but you'll get through. So it's like the in ethics, in philosophy classes 101, you do the trolley problem. You know that it's similar. It's do I save everyone, or do I will everyone die, including me, without my making a choice that they die? They just get set down, or do I choose to sacrifice in order for the others and to live? It's a classic question of leadership. Soldiers to this day suffer from, and yeah, I mean, I think there's psychological realism in the Iliad. Of course, there is. There's wonderful moments like, you know, Priam and Achilles, Priam begging for his son's body, for Hector's body. I mean, it makes me cry every time I read it. It's just extraordinary. And then there are the moments like Hector when Astyanax, his son, is brought up to him before he goes into battle.
That's the part where I lose it.
The nodding plume, and it's just, oh God, it's really astonishing, isn't it? But the ones in the Odyssey somehow seem so much more modern to us, I think. There is a general feeling in scholars, I think, is there not, that most of the Iliad seems to be by a different author than most of the Odyssey. You need to be too good at Greek to be able to, there's all kinds of deep analysis of the text there, and clever dating of things. But there's certainly a difference in style. I mean, apart from anything else, the sheer brilliance of its cinematic flashbacks, its novelistic approach to things, the fact that it begins with the Telemachy, not with Odysseus stuck on Calypso's isle at all, but with the gods, of course, and with this wonderful background, giving us what Penelope and Telemachus have gone through, and then the marvelous journey to Pylos to see Nestor, and then to see Menelaus, and Menelaus then giving a backstory of his own Nostos, his own, and that's a very comic scene with Proteus and the seals, and having all the, but then saying, oh, by the way, Telemachus, Proteus also said, apart from telling us how to get home to Sparta, he said, your friend Laertides, the son of Odysseus, Odysseus, he's stuck on Ogygia, on Calypso's isle, and Telemachus that's when he hears there is hope, and as it were cut to Odysseus gazing out to sea, a favorite subject for quite a few artists for obvious reasons. It's the longing, it's the hero at rest, and 7 years of that, I mean, and then my favorite bit, I think, is when Calypso rather slyly pretends to Odysseus that it's her idea. I've decided I'm going to let you home. She doesn't reveal that Hermes has come and said Zeus insists that you let him go. And she said, I've decided to let you go. I dare say Calypso is, I'm sorry, I dare say Ithaca is much more beautiful than my island. You're so keen to get to it. And he says, no, it's rocky, scraggy, terrible place. You can barely grow wheat on it or barley. It's mostly fit for goats and pigs, but it's home.
Yeah.
And then she says, well, and of course your wife, Penelope, must be so much more beautiful than me. Are you joking? She's my age now. She won't look anything like you. You're a goddess. You shine with beauty. But she's my wife, and I want to be home. I mean, that is just, you forgive him a lot with that. You really do. Of course, the absolute complete murder of the suitors is pretty brutal, but he's he spares Phemius and his bard at least, and a few others. But yeah, I mean, it's such a brilliant and extraordinary way of telling that story. And when I was planning to write it, my retelling of it, I thought, well, I've got to include Agamemnon, obviously, and the whole Oresteia bit afterwards, and I'll include Iphigenia in Tauris, as Euripides puts it, i.e., their visit to find her, and the Areopagus, the trial that you get in the Oresteia. And I've got to include the Menelaus, obviously, but that's in Homer, where he tells his coming home, but also Aeneas. I've got to follow a bit of the Aeneid and the adventures he has going home. But maybe what order shall I tell it in? Then you realise that as far as the Odyssey is concerned, you can't mess with Homer's order of storytelling. It works so brilliantly, particularly when he leaves Calypso's isle. You think, well, hang on, what's the backstory? Well, how did he get home from? Well, how did he get that far? And then he gets washed up. You have the wonderful Leucothea, the white goddess, Ito, and giving him his veil, and he gets to Scheria, and then the Demodocus the bard tries to tell him the story, and Odysseus goes, "No, you've got it all wrong. Let me tell you." And that's when it begins. And I mean, that's just genius. That is on any level, modern storytelling or ancient storytelling. It is stupendous. A narrative art to tell the story in that way. It's matchless.
You really are. You're captivated the whole time. And the amazing thing is, with so much of the Greek mythologies, you know how it ends, and you're still captivated. And they maintain that element of suspense. It's just
Exactly.
remarkable.
And they do that even in their plays.
Yeah, of course.
You all know the ending of the plays.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that, you know, these heroes, they're more multifaceted. And I think that's
Yeah,
it's a reflection of the realization that the world isn't so black and white, that people are complicated, that both
exactly.
their gods and their heroes are not these sort of one-dimensional perfect beings. And that makes them more relatable, more interesting. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to, you know, have
Yeah,
their comeuppance for that. Like it's something to
indeed.
engage. Yeah.
And ditto their villains, as it were. You do feel for, even though you can't sense Homer asking you to, you feel for Polyphemus. You know, he's a brute, the Cyclops, and but he's had his eye burnt, out, and
Oh.
he's been mocked, and you just feel his rage, and it's really sad. Yeah, it is absolutely remarkable how as you say, the complexity of the characters and I always compare it the way it goes from in Hesiod's Theogony, where he just tells of chaos and then the first gods emerging, Ether and Nyx and Erebus and Gaia and Uranus. I think that's like, you're too young to remember probably, but in the early 80s, the first video games were very blocky, kind of, the first one was like, Pong, the tennis game, with just simply one white square going up and down the edge of screen, or oblong rather, and the ball was a square that just bounced. It had no personality, no color, no dimension. But then as the computing power increased and increased, you started to get color, but it was still a bit blocky. And if you look at a late 80s game now, you go, well, there's not much to it. But somehow slowly it developed, and now they're three-dimensional, they're shaded, they've got light and shadow and character and fullness. And that's what happens to the gods and the heroes and the various characters of Greek myth, isn't it? That they start off a bit, oh, I'm a Titan, and then and slowly they become more sophisticated and more rounded.
Well, and
It's
like you saying Medusa before, I mean, she begins
mm,
literally as a floating head with wings, you know, and then
yeah,
her body comes later, you know, it's
yes, that's
amazing.
true. Yeah,
It's so fantastic to
and
see how
and
these
and
develop.
how did Jung and Joseph Campbell and all the interpreters of myth who were so confident in their psychological explanations, I wonder what they said about that extraordinary idea that out of the ugly, violent moment of Perseus severing Medusa's head, out should come both a monster and Pegasus,
I
one of
know.
the most beautiful creatures in all myth. This wonderful white flying horse. It's most interesting that they imagined that. The horse, yes, is related to Poseidon, and what was inside her were presumably as a result of the rape, children of Poseidon. So the fact that a horse is not surprising, but a flying horse, not a swimming horse, should have been a hippopotamus, a river horse.
Or a
But
snake course, I don't know.
yeah. So very often you are caught short by the surprises.
But I just want to say for very, very, very quickly to mention your new Substack, that you kind of moved over
Oh,
to the Substack
yes.
crowd. And I saw that you joined Substack. I've been there for a while and I was really excited. So I just wanted to ask how it's going there and what made you jump on the Substack train.
Well, I looked at it, and I miss writing from time to time. I can't write for newspapers. I find them, just I, newspapers, British newspapers in particular. Um, and I thought of the various options, Patreon and so on. I thought Substack, with its emphasis on writing and writers, and I followed quite a lot of writers who I find really interesting, and I read their effusions. And my only guilt about it is that I haven't been writing every week, and I think, oh God, but I've just been literally too busy, and I don't want to write subpar stuff, or at least what I think of as subpar. But I like the atmosphere of it. I don't really join in with the notes and the social media aspects of it, because I'm just so relieved, having been a social media hound from the early days of Twitter. I really happily left now, since the musking of Twitter. I'm really not wanting to be involved, and so I don't want to get back on that horse, as it were. But otherwise, I think it's a great space, and there's some brilliant people there, really interesting people. And I've learned a lot reading their pieces, and it feels like, the water's nice and warm. And so far, unlike Twitter, no turds floating along the surface, or no rusty, shopping carts on the
Yeah.
floor to cut your feet on or anything.
Well, with that imagery, now, well, I want to say thank you so much. I'll put links, of course, to your Substack and to your books, and I
Indeed.
just love that you've done a big broad stroke with the classics. So for anybody who is maybe not familiar with it or wants to reinforce it, I think it's just wonderful to read straight through and get the whole fantastic story with your fantastic wit.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.